September 1948. 3 years after VJ Day, the banners are gone, the uniforms are back in closets, America's buying cars, building suburbs, and pretending the word ration never existed. And then the letters go out. Not for war, not for invasion, not for Pearl Harbor, for preparedness. For the first time in U.S. history, Congress has approved a peacetime draft. No shooting, no declared enemy, just tension, the kind that doesn't explode, it tightens. The war ended in 1945. But in 1948, the United States quietly decided it might never truly be over. When Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, it was sold as a precaution. Europe was already at war. Germany had rolled through Poland, Norway, France. Britain stood alone. The United States was officially neutral, but not naive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt argued that the country needed to prepare, not because it wanted war, but because it might not get to choose. The 1940 Act required men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register. Service was set at 12 months. The messaging was careful. This was not permanent. This was insurance. And for the moment, it seemed like enough. Then came Pearl Harbor. The draft expanded, age ranges widened, service terms lengthened. What began as preparedness became total mobilization. By the end of World War II, more than 10 million men had been inducted through selective service. The system became the backbone of the largest military force the United States has ever fielded. But once Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in September, the public mood shifted almost overnight. Bring them home. That was the demand. Families wanted sons back. Factories wanted workers back. Universities wanted classrooms filled again. Soldiers who had fought across North Africa, Europe, the Pacific, they wanted civilian life. The draft, in the public imagination, was tied to emergency. And emergencies, by definition, end. Congress responded to pressure. Demobilization began rapidly. Millions were discharged within a year. The Army, which had swollen to over 8 million personnel during the war, shrank dramatically. By 1947, it was a fraction of its wartime size. The expectation was clear. The draft would fade away with the war. And legally, it did. The Wartime Draft Authority expired on March 31, 1947. For the first time since 1940, there was no active conscription law in effect. The United States returned, at least on paper, to a volunteer military tradition that had defined most of its history. But there was a problem. The Army wasn't stabilizing. It was hollowing out. Voluntary enlistments were far lower than planners had hoped. Occupation forces in Germany and Japan required manpower. Strategic planners were increasingly concerned about the Soviet Union's behavior in Eastern Europe. The atomic bomb provided deterrence, but not manpower. Military leadership began warning Congress that the force was dangerously under strength, not just small, but brittle. Units existed on paper that couldn't deploy at strength. Training cycles were inconsistent, equipment stockpiles were thin. America had won the war, but it had dismantled the machine that won it. The draft of 1940 was supposed to be temporary, a bridge over crisis, a tool for total war. Instead, it had revealed something uncomfortable. Modern war required modern mobilization, and modern mobilization did not turn on and off cleanly. By 1947, policymakers were confronting a reality few Americans wanted to consider. What if the next conflict didn't come with years of warning? What if the next war began not with buildup, but with surprise? The United States had demobilized. The world, however, had not. If 1946 was supposed to feel like peace, it didn't. The cities of Europe were rubble. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Japan was rebuilding under American supervision. But the deeper shift wasn't physical, it was political. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed governments were consolidating control. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary. Elections were held, but outcomes were managed. Opposition parties disappeared. Borders hardened. What had been wartime alliance lines were becoming ideological frontiers. In March 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. Standing beside President Harry S. Truman, Churchill described a dividing line descending across Europe. The phrase stuck because it felt accurate. Cooperation was fading. Suspicion was hardening. American policymakers were watching closely. In 1947, the crisis moved south. Communist insurgents were gaining ground in Greece. Turkey faced pressure over control of the strategic Turkish Straits. Britain, exhausted economically, informed Washington it could no longer shoulder the burden of stabilizing the region. The question landed squarely in Truman's lap. Would the United States step in? The answer came in March 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. Truman asked Congress for aid to Greece and Turkey, framing it not as regional politics, but as a global contest between free peoples and authoritarian expansion. It was a rhetorical turning point. The United States was no longer reacting to war. It was positioning itself to contain one. Containment required credibility. Credibility required force. And force required manpower. At the same time, the American atomic monopoly, the ultimate wartime advantage, was not assumed to be permanent. Intelligence analysts understood that Soviet scientists were working aggressively to develop their own bomb. The U.S. had nuclear superiority in 1945. By 1947, planners were asking how long that would last. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army was shrinking faster than strategy could adapt. In Europe, American occupation forces were tasked with supervising Germany's transition while also deterring Soviet aggression. In Asia, forces were overseeing Japan's reconstruction. These were not ceremonial presences, they were strategic tripwires. Then came Berlin. In June 1948, Soviet authorities blocked all ground access routes to West Berlin, attempting to force Western allies out of the city. The crisis that became the Berlin blockade placed American resolve on public display. The U.S. responded with the Berlin Airlift, a massive logistical operation to supply the city by air. But beneath the spectacle of cargo planes landing every few minutes was a quieter concern. If the Soviets pushed further, the United States did not have a large, ready army in Europe. Strategic planners faced a contradiction. The American public wanted demobilization. Congress wanted reduced budgets. The economy was transitioning from wartime production to consumer growth. There was no declared war, no battlefield. And yet the international system looked unstable. The emerging Cold War was different from World War II. It was not mobilization against a visible invading army. It was pressure, positioning, influence. It required presence. It required deterrence. It required units ready before a crisis began, not months afterward. Military leaders began arguing that relying solely on volunteers was too slow and too unpredictable. Training a modern soldier took time. Building units from scratch took longer. If the Soviet Union tested American resolve in Europe, in Asia, somewhere unexpected, the United States might not have the manpower cushion to respond. In 1940, the draft had been justified by a clear, visible war overseas. By 1947 and 1948, the threat was more abstract, but no less real to those reading intelligence briefings. The war had ended, but the peace was unstable. And policymakers were beginning to ask a politically dangerous question. What if the United States could not afford to wait for the next shot to be fired before it started preparing? By early 1948, the math was uncomfortable. The Army's authorized strength hovered around 550,000 men. Actual readiness was worse. Divisions were underfilled, equipment shortages persisted, training pipelines were inconsistent, units existed on paper that could not deploy at combat strength. President Harry S. Truman did not want another mobilization scramble like 1940. He had watched the early months of World War II closely. The rush training, the equipment shortages, the scramble to convert industry. That delay had been survivable once. It might not be twice. So he asked Congress for something unprecedented in peacetime, renewed conscription. The proposal was direct. Reinstate selective service. Require young men to register. Maintain a steady flow of inductees to stabilize force levels. Not for invasion, not for war, for readiness. It did not land gently. Opposition came from multiple directions. Some lawmakers argued that the Constitution did not envision compulsory military service outside declared war. Others feared creating a permanent militarized state. The United States had historically relied on volunteers in peacetime. Standing armies made Americans uneasy. The memory of European militarism was still fresh. There were budget concerns as well. Demobilization had reduced defense spending sharply. Voters wanted tax relief, not expanded military obligations. And then there was public sentiment. The war had been brutal and global. Families had sacrificed for 4 years. Millions had served. To ask for peacetime conscription only 3 years after victory felt, to many, like moving the goalposts. Military leadership countered with cold arithmetic. General Omar Bradley, then Army Chief of Staff, warned that volunteer enlistments were not meeting requirements. Occupation forces in Germany and Japan needed rotation. Training cycles required predictable intake. Strategic planning could not depend on fluctuating enlistment rates. The debate sharpened after the Berlin crisis escalated in mid-1948. The Berlin blockade made abstract tensions visible. Soviet pressure was no longer theoretical. American aircrews were flying daily missions into a city cut off by land. The Cold War had moved from speech to confrontation. Supporters of conscription framed the issue as deterrence. A prepared army reduced the likelihood of miscalculation. Weakness invited testing. Critics warned that permanent conscription normalized emergency powers. If the draft continued in peacetime, when would it ever end? The legislative vehicle became the Selective Service Act of 1948, sometimes referred to as the Elston Act, after Representative Charles Elston of Ohio. The bill required men aged 18 to 25 to register, with induction primarily targeting those 19 to 25. Service would be set at 21 months, followed by reserve obligations. The proposal included local draft boards, echoing the decentralized structure of the World War II system. That design choice was deliberate. Local control had softened resistance in the 1940s by embedding the system with communities rather than posing it solely from Washington. Debate in Congress was intense but pragmatic. Lawmakers were not arguing whether the Soviet Union posed a challenge. Most agreed it did. The disagreement centered on method. Could a volunteer force meet the demand? Would expanded pay and benefits suffice? Was conscription an overcorrection? Truman pushed firmly but without theatrical rhetoric. His argument was simple: preparedness now prevents mobilization panic later. The bill passed the House in June 1948. The Senate followed. Truman signed it into law on June 24, 1948, the same day the Berlin blockade began. The timing was coincidence. The symbolism was not. For the first time in American history, the United States enacted a draft without an ongoing war. There was no battlefield, there was no invasion, there was only strategic uncertainty, and Congress had chosen readiness over tradition. The decision marked a structural shift in American military policy. Conscription was no longer just a wartime lever. It was becoming an instrument of long-term strategy. The debate had asked whether democracy could sustain compulsory service in peacetime. The vote answered yes. The question now was what that meant, not just for the Army, but for every 18-year-old man who would soon receive a registration notice in the mail. The debate was philosophical. The law was administrative. When President Harry S. Truman signed the Selective Service Act of 1948, it did not create a vague authority. It built a machine. Every male citizen and most male residents between 18 and 25 were required to register. Induction eligibility focused primarily on men ages 19 through 25. The initial term of active service was set at 21 months, followed by a reserve obligation that could extend total military liability to 5 years. This was not an emergency surge, it was a pipeline. Registration began in August 1948. Millions complied. The system relied heavily on the same decentralized structure that had functioned during World War II, local draft boards. Thousands of civilian volunteers, appointed from within their own communities, reviewed classifications, deferments, and exemptions. That design mattered. Local boards meant your neighbors were reviewing your status, not distant bureaucrats. The theory was that community oversight would make the system more legitimate and more flexible. Classification categories reappeared. 1A, available for military service. 4F, not acceptable due to physical, mental, or moral standards. Other classifications covered deferments for students, essential occupations, or hardship cases. Conscientious objector provisions were included. Men who opposed war on religious or moral grounds could apply for non-combatant service or alternative civilian assignments, though approval required scrutiny. The system did not accept casual objection. It required documented belief. Unlike the later Vietnam-era draft, deferments for married men were not automatically guaranteed under the initial 1948 structure, nor were college deferments as expansive in the early phase as they would later become. The law's early years focused more narrowly on manpower stabilization than social accommodation. Medical standards were strict. A significant percentage of registrants were classified 4F, echoing World War II patterns. The Army was rebuilding, but it was not lowering all thresholds. Planners wanted trained, deployable forces, not numbers on paper. The Act also created a formal federal framework, the modern Selective Service System. While the system had existed during World War II, the 1948 law institutionalized it for peacetime continuity. This was no longer a temporary wartime office. It became a standing administrative body. The permanence was the quiet revolution. In previous American wars, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, conscription was tied to declared conflict. The apparatus expanded during crisis and contracted afterward. In 1948, the apparatus stayed. Induction quotas were modest at first. The goal was not rapid expansion to millions, but steady intake. The Army needed predictable manpower to fill occupation duties, maintain readiness, and avoid hollow divisions. Training bases operated on controlled cycles. Units rotated overseas with more stability. The system also emphasized reserve obligations. Even after active duty ended, men remained liable for recall. This created a manpower cushion without maintaining massive active forces, a hybrid approach between total mobilization and pure volunteerism. Critics feared the bureaucracy would become self-perpetuating. Once established, would selective service ever truly shut down? Supporters argued the opposite. Maintaining infrastructure in peacetime prevented chaotic reconstruction later. Operationally, the 1948 Act did something subtle but profound. It shifted American defense planning from reactive to anticipatory. Instead of waiting for crisis and then expanding, the country maintained a baseline of trained manpower. It accepted that modern conflict might move faster than legislative response. Aircraft traveled farther, weapons struck harder. Warning time could be measured in weeks, not years. The draft system provided elasticity. If tension spiked up, call-ups could increase. If conditions stabilized, intake could be reduced. The framework remained in place either way. By late 1948 and into 1949, the numbers were not dramatic. Inductions were steady but controlled. Many Americans barely noticed. There was no massive mobilization headline, no posters demanding enlistment, just registration notices, classification letters, induction orders, routine, procedural, bureaucratic. That normalcy was the point. The 1948 Act did not prepare the United States for a specific war. It prepared it for uncertainty. And in doing so, it embedded compulsory service into the architecture of Cold War strategy, not as an exception, but as a standing capability. By 1949, the United States Army looked nothing like the force that had crossed the Rhine or stormed Pacific Islands. It was smaller, leaner, scattered. But it was no longer collapsing. The Selective Service Act of 1948 had begun to do exactly what its supporters promised: stabilize manpower. Induction numbers were not massive, but they were steady. Units that had existed only on organizational charts were gradually filling out. Training cycles became predictable again. This was not the Army of Total War. It was something different, the first true Cold War Army. Occupational duties still dominated overseas commitments. In Germany, U.S. forces formed part of the Western presence facing Soviet-controlled East Germany. In Japan, American troops remained essential to reconstruction and political oversight. These were not symbolic deployments, they were strategic anchors. Then came NATO. In April 1949, the United States joined the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, committing to a collective defense in Europe. Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all, formalized what had previously been implicit. American ground forces were now part of a standing alliance structure. Alliance commitments require credible force levels. Without conscription, planners feared the United States would struggle to maintain those commitments while also preserving readiness at home. Volunteer enlistments alone were not matching projections. Pay increases and recruitment campaigns helped, but not enough. The draft became the quiet backbone of alliance credibility. At the same time, defense planners were rethinking strategy. The atomic bomb was still the ultimate deterrent, but it was not a substitute for ground forces. Nuclear weapons could destroy cities. They could not occupy territory. They could not reassure allies through presence. And in August 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic device. The American monopoly ended earlier than many expected. The logic of manpower changed overnight. If nuclear parity was emerging, then conventional forces regained importance. The idea that atomic superiority alone could deter aggression weakened. A hollow army now looked riskier than it had in 1948. The draft-fed army was still small compared to World War II levels, hovering around 500,000 active personnel in the late 1940s. But it was structured differently. Divisions were maintained at more sustainable peacetime strengths. Training emphasized rapid deployability rather than long buildup. There were still weaknesses. Equipment modernization lagged. Budget pressures constrained expansion. Some units rotated through occupation duties with limited live-fire training time. The transition from wartime industrial output to peacetime defense production created friction. But the force no longer felt like it was dissolving. The draft also created a generational shift in service expectations. Many of the men inducted in 1948 and 1949 had grown up during World War II, but had not fought in it. Their military experience would be shaped not by global war, but by geopolitical tension. They trained not for invasion of France or island-hopping campaigns, but for deterrence against a superpower adversary. The Army's identity was changing. It was no longer mobilizing to defeat a specific enemy regime. It was positioning to prevent a conflict that might never formally begin. That strategic posture, constant readiness without declared war, required steady manpower, not surge mobilization, not patriotic rush, predictable intake. The draft provided that predictability. By 1950, the United States had built a force that was neither fully demobilized nor fully mobilized. It was suspended between war and peace, structured for both. And then, in June 1950, that suspended state ended. The 1948 draft did not arrive with parades or protest marches. It arrived with paperwork. Registration cards, classification notices, induction dates printed in plain type. For many Americans, it felt procedural, almost routine. After all, millions had registered during World War II. The mechanism was familiar. What was new was the timing. There was no declared war. That subtle shift changed how the system was perceived. Compliance rates were high. Most eligible men registered without incident. The memory of World War II still framed military service as legitimate civic duty. Patriotism had not evaporated after 1945. It had simply shifted tone. Instead of mobilizing for invasions, Americans were now mobilizing for vigilance. Local draft boards played a stabilizing role. Because classification decisions were made within communities, the system felt less anonymous. Appeals could be heard. Hardship cases could be reviewed. Essential occupations, agriculture, certain industrial roles could be considered for deferment when justified. But fairness was complicated. Medical rejections, 4F classifications, were significant, as in World War II. Physical and mental standards disqualified a noticeable percentage of registrants. That left a narrower pool eligible for induction. Questions inevitably followed. Who was fit enough, and who wasn't? Were standards applied evenly across regions? Education deferments were limited in the early phase compared to what would come in the 1960s, but they existed. College enrollment offered temporary postponement in certain circumstances. That raised quiet concerns about inequality. Students, more often from middle-class backgrounds, were more likely to delay service than men already working full-time jobs. The disparities were not yet as politicized as they would later become, but the seeds were visible. Religious communities engaged the issue carefully. Conscientious objector status was available under the Selective Service Act of 1948, but it required documented, deeply held opposition to war in all forms, not selective objection. Applicants faced scrutiny from local boards. Some were approved for non-combatant services. Others were assigned alternative civilian work contributing to national interests. Labor unions, having supported wartime mobilization, were generally cautious but not hostile. The post-war economy was strong. Defense spending supported industrial sectors. The draft, at least initially, did not trigger widespread labor opposition. Universities saw fluctuating enrollment patterns. Some young men accelerated studies before induction. Others delayed enrollment until after service. The idea of serving 2 years before beginning a career became normalized for a generation. And normalization may have been the most significant social effect. Because the 1948 draft did not accompany mass combat headlines, it blended into everyday life. There were no casualty lists dominating newspapers in 1948 or 1949. Inductees trained, deployed to occupation zones, rotated home. Service became a chapter in life rather than a defining trauma, at least at first. The absence of immediate war muted resistance. There were critics, certainly. Civil libertarians warned that permanent conscription altered the relationship between citizen and state. Some conservatives argued it expanded federal power too comfortably. Others feared it might become self-perpetuating, that once institutionalized, the draft would justify its own existence. But broad national unrest did not materialize. Part of that restraint stemmed from context. The Soviet Union was increasingly portrayed as an ideological adversary. The Berlin blockade had reinforced the sense of confrontation. Even without battlefield fighting, tension felt real enough to justify precaution. For most American families, the draft meant one thing. Their sons might spend 2 years in uniform during peacetime. That expectation reshaped life planning. Employment decisions adjusted. Marriages were timed differently. Career paths paused. Service became something assumed rather than debated. And because it was assumed, because it was structured, bureaucratic, predictable, it did not feel revolutionary. But it was. For the first time in American history, military obligation in peacetime became routine. The system was quiet. The implications were not. At 4 a.m. on June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel. The Cold War, which had simmered through speeches and blockades, turned kinetic. The Korean War did not begin as a superpower clash. It began as a regional invasion. But within days, the United States committed air and naval forces. Within weeks, American ground troops were moving. And suddenly, the peacetime draft was no longer theoretical insurance. It was essential. The army that deployed to Korea in mid-1950 was understrength and underprepared in key areas. Some units were rushed from occupation duty in Japan with limited heavy equipment. Early engagements exposed training gaps and logistical weaknesses. The assumption that deterrence alone might suffice evaporated quickly. Manpower requirements surged. Induction calls increased dramatically under the framework of the Selective Service Act of 1948. What had been steady, controlled intake became accelerated mobilization. Service terms were extended. Reserve call-ups expanded. Congress amended the law to adjust induction numbers and extend active duty obligations beyond the original 21 months. The machinery built in 1948 proved decisive. Registration systems were already in place. Local boards were operational. Classification procedures were functioning. Instead of rebuilding a draft from scratch, the government scaled an existing structure. That saved months, perhaps longer. Army strength climbed rapidly. From roughly 590,000 active duty personnel in mid-1950, the force expanded toward 1.5 million by 1952. National Guard and Reserve components were activated. Training pipelines accelerated. The draft became the primary source of new soldiers. Without it, planners would have relied entirely on voluntary enlistment and emergency legislative scramble, the very scenario Truman had warned against 2 years earlier. Korea validated the argument for preparedness, but it also complicated the politics of conscription. The war was not framed as World War III. It was officially described as a police action under United Nations authority. There was no formal declaration of war by Congress. Yet American casualties mounted. Combat intensity was high. Rotations were shorter and less predictable than occupation service had been. For inductees, the distinction between peacetime draft and wartime combat vanished. Many of the young men who registered in 1948, expecting 2 quiet years, found themselves in Korea's hills and freezing winters. The draft had promised readiness. Korea delivered combat. Public support for the war was initially strong, especially following North Korea's rapid advance towards Busan. But as the conflict settled into stalemate, advances, retreats, the Chinese intervention in late 1950, fatigue grew. Casualties without decisive victory tested patience. The draft absorbed that tension. Criticism emerged over deferments and perceived inequities. Industrial exemptions were debated. Educational deferments expanded modestly. Questions surfaced about fairness across regions and economic classes. The system, though structured, was not immune to pressure. Congress responded with revisions. In 1951, the Universal Military Training and Service Act replaced the 1948 statute, extending draft authority and broadening obligations. The structure remained familiar, but the scale reflected wartime necessity. The Cold War draft had become a hot war draft. Strategically, Korea reinforced a lesson American planners would carry for decades. Deterrence requires both nuclear capability and conventional force readiness. The United States increased defense spending significantly. NATO force levels were reassessed. Military budgets stabilized at higher baselines. Institutionally, the draft proved durable. It could operate in tension, it could scale in crisis, it could normalize in relative calm. What began in 1948 as a controversial peacetime precaution became, by 1951, an unquestioned wartime necessity. The decision Congress had made in June 1948, without invasion, without declared war, now looked less radical. It looked prescient. The Cold War was no longer abstract, and the draft was no longer preventive. It was sustaining a war thousands of miles from home, fought by men who had registered when the country was technically at peace. By the time the guns in Korea settled into armistice talks in 1953, something fundamental had changed in American policy. The draft was no longer controversial infrastructure. It was permanent architecture. The emergency logic of 1948 had matured into institutional routine. The original Selective Service Act of 1948 had already been replaced in 1951 by broader legislation extending draft authority, but the framework remained the same: mandatory registration, local draft boards, induction quotas, reserve obligations. The important shift was psychological. In 1948, conscription without war felt experimental. By the early 1950s, conscription felt normal. Defense planning adapted accordingly. The United States no longer viewed mobilization as something triggered only by invasion. Instead, it maintained a layered force structure, active duty personnel supported by a large pool of trained reservists, many of whom had entered through selective service. The draft created predictability in a strategic environment defined by unpredictability. Proposals emerged to go even further. Universal military training, a concept that would have required nearly all young men to undergo a period of structured military instruction, gained attention in Congress. Supporters argued it would equalize service and strengthen national readiness. Critics feared it would militarize society unnecessarily. The idea was debated but never fully implemented. Even without universal training, the draft embedded military obligation into American adulthood. Turning 18 now carried a federal requirement: register. Local draft boards became permanent civic fixtures. Thousands of volunteers continued reviewing classifications. Appeal systems remained active. The bureaucracy refined procedures, adjusted quotas, and maintained databases, all during periods without declared war. The establishment of the formal selective service system as a standing federal entity ensured continuity. Instead of dismantling the apparatus after Korea, policymakers maintained it at baseline readiness. The logic was clear: rebuilding a draft from scratch would take time the country might not have in a future crisis. The Cold War reinforced that assumption. Soviet nuclear capability eliminated the luxury of slow mobilization. The Korean conflict had demonstrated that conventional war could erupt without global escalation. Europe remained tense. Asia remained unstable. The strategic calendar did not offer predictable warning. So the draft stayed. Its scale fluctuated. Induction numbers rose during Korea and declined afterward. Service terms adjusted. Policies evolved. But the core premise, compulsory registration and potential induction, endured. For a generation of American men in the 1950s, 2 years in uniform became a common life chapter. Not universal, but widespread enough to feel routine. Military service, once episodic in American history, became cyclical. And that cycle had begun not in 1950, but in 1948, before Korea, before NATO expansion, before Soviet atomic parity. The late 1940s decision to re-establish conscription in peacetime had reshaped the national security model. It tied citizenship to conditional military obligation, even without declared war. It made preparedness structural rather than reactive. By institutionalizing selective service, the United States accepted a new strategic reality. The next war might not announce itself. And readiness could not be optional. The draft worked. That did not mean it was comfortable. From the moment Congress passed the Selective Service Act of 1948, a deeper question lingered beneath the strategic logic. Can a free society compel service in peacetime without altering its own character? Legally, the foundation was already in place. During World War I, the Supreme Court had upheld the constitutionality of conscription in the selective draft law cases. The court ruled that Congress's power to raise and support armies included compulsory service. That precedent did not expire with war. But precedent and philosophy are different things. Historically, the United States had distrusted standing armies. The revolutionary generation associated permanent military establishments with tyranny. The early republic relied on militias and volunteers, expanding only during crisis. Conscription had appeared during the Civil War, again in World War I, and then in World War II, but always tethered to active conflict. The 1948 Act severed that tether. No invasion, no declaration, no battlefield. Just anticipation. Supporters argued that modern warfare erased the luxury of delay. Aircraft crossed oceans in hours. Nuclear weapons shortened timelines even further. Waiting for formal declarations before preparing forces was strategically irresponsible. The Constitution empowered Congress to provide for the common defense, and defense sometimes required preparation before attack. Critics countered that peacetime conscription inverted the presumption of liberty. Instead of government proving necessary in crisis, citizens were required to justify exemption in calm. Military obligation became the default, not the exception. The ethical tension centered on compulsion versus consent. Volunteer service reflects choice. Conscription reflects obligation. The Cold War draft blurred that distinction by embedding obligation into routine life. An 18-year-old male citizen did not choose whether to register. He complied. Even conscientious objector provisions raised philosophical debates. The law recognized deeply held religious opposition to war, but not selective moral disagreement with particular conflicts. The state defined the boundaries of acceptable dissent. There was also the matter of equality. Did the draft distribute burden evenly across classes and regions? Were deferments applied consistently? Did local board discretion induce bias? While the late 1940s draft was less publicly contentious than the Vietnam-era system would become, concerns about fairness did not originate in the 1960s. They were present from the beginning. Yet broad constitutional challenges did not overturn the law. The judiciary remained deferential to Congress in matters of national defense. The Supreme Court's earlier rulings continued to anchor the draft's legality. Peacetime did not negate congressional authority. What changed was the civic baseline. Military service was no longer an episodic response to declared war. It became an institutionalized expectation, contingent but persistent. In practical terms, the 1948 decision altered the relationship between citizen and state. In principle, it asked Americans to accept a quiet trade-off. Greater readiness for less certainty. Security before emergency. Obligation without immediate crisis. For many, that trade felt justified by geopolitical reality. For others, it marked the beginning of a national security posture that would prove difficult to unwind. The law endured. The debate never fully disappeared. By the time the United States transitioned to an all-volunteer force in 1973, the draft had shaped nearly a quarter century of American military policy. But its modern foundation was laid in 1948. The Selective Service Act of 1948 created the template that would carry through Korea, into the Cold War buildup of the 1950s, and eventually into the Vietnam era. The structure, registration at 18, classification by local boards, induction quotas adjusted to strategic need, proved adaptable across vastly different conflicts. The scale changed, the controversy changed, the politics intensified in later decades. The framework remained recognizable. Even after the end of active conscription in 1973, the administration's skeleton endured. The Selective Service system was not dismantled permanently. Registration requirements were suspended in 1975, then reinstated in 1980 during renewed Cold War tensions following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That continuity reflects the enduring logic of 1948. The United States accepted that modern war might provide little warning. It accepted that rebuilding a draft infrastructure from nothing would take too long in crisis. So the system stayed in dormant readiness, scaled down but operational. The 1948 Act also reshaped expectations of citizenship for an entire generation. For men coming of age in the 1950s and early 1960s, registration and potential service were assumed milestones. Career paths, educational decisions, marriages, all were planned with military obligation in mind. This normalization had long-term consequences. By the time Vietnam escalated in the mid-1960s, the draft was not a new policy introduced for that war. It was an inherited system. The protests, deferment controversies, and legal battles of that era unfolded within a structure built in the late 1940s. In that sense, 1948 did more than stabilize manpower. It institutionalized a Cold War posture. Strategically, the act marked a shift from reactive mobilization to sustained readiness. Instead of expanding forces only after invasion, the United States maintained a baseline of trained personnel prepared to scale upward. That approach shaped NATO commitments, deterrence theory, and defense budgeting for decades. Culturally, it blurred the line between wartime and peacetime obligation. Military service became less an emergency measure and more a potential civic phase, even in calm. Legally, it affirmed that Congress's authority to compel service did not depend on declared war. The Constitution's grant of power to raise armies could operate preemptively. Today, active conscription is not in force, but registration remains required for most men at age 18. The machinery built in 1948, revised, amended, modernized, still exists. The Cold War draft began not with gunfire, but with legislation. It did not respond to invasion. It anticipated it. And in doing so, it permanently altered how the United States thinks about readiness, responsibility, and the quiet obligations of citizenship in an uncertain world. The Selective Service Act of 1948 did not begin with explosions. It began with doubt. 3 years after the most destructive war in human history, the United States faced a decision: trust that peace would hold, or prepare for the possibility that it wouldn't. Congress chose preparation. No invasion forced its hand, no declaration compelled it, only the realization that modern war might arrive without warning. In that moment, the country crossed a line it had long resisted. Conscription was no longer a temporary wartime measure. It became a standing capability, a structural commitment, a quiet expectation. The Cold War would bring crises, proxy wars, nuclear standoffs, and eventually Vietnam. But the framework that sustained those decades of readiness began in 1948, in committee rooms, not on battlefields. The war was over. The uncertainty was not. And so the draft stayed. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.